Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Chitheads. My guest today is David Buckland. David is a former IT consultant who lives on Vancouver Island in the temperate rainforest of southwest Canada. He began his spiritual journey in the mid-1970s. On a long retreat soon after, he began witnessing full-time, and refined perception clicked on with a bang. He has now been meditating and exploring consciousness for more than 40 years. Soon after awakening in 2007, he began writing online under the nickname Davidya. The name and related blog, davidya.ca, soon took on a life of its own. In 2011, he earned an MA in Vedic Science, studying Vedic literature, Sanskrit, and world religions. He has observed and spoken with many people having shifts in consciousness and has been working to synthesize historical understanding with modern experience. So with that, hello, David. Thanks so much for joining me.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm happy to be here.
So as I was mentioning before we started the recording, I've spent the last couple of days reviewing a lot of your writings and listening to a really fascinating and kind of mind-blowing podcast episode with Rick of Buddha at the Gas Pump podcast. And so I'm really looking forward to, talking to you a little bit today about some of those areas that you talk with Rick about, but also specifically kind of the 7 stages of consciousness as you outline them. And I found this to be particularly inspiring because it resonates a lot with what my own teacher teaches, which is kind of the importance of understanding the kind of architecture of consciousness and the ways in which these stages can sometimes get confused with each other, or we can speak about consciousness in general from the perspective of one stage. And so there's a lot of it feels like kind of misunderstanding where you very clearly, particularly in your book and on your blog, kind of delineate these, clear stages, but in a way that's not dogmatic. You sort of always, you step back from describing something and saying, well, it could also be sort of subjectively perceived differently based on someone's, karma or whatever. So before we get into all that, I would love to just hear, maybe an abridged version of that story of your own awakening process. I know you've had enough experiences to, comprise a whole encyclopedia of spiritual experiences. But if you could give us kind of the highlights of your own story and how you've come to understand what we might call that kind of architecture of consciousness.
Okay. The process started for me in as you mentioned in the introduction, in the mid 70s, 1970s, when I went on a long retreat, a 6-month retreat to learn to teach meditation.
Mm-hmm.
And about halfway through that, I started witnessing full time. And that basically means that I shifted from being a person here in the body mind, experience myself as a body mind, into being a detached observer of the body mind and its behavior. However, I did not, I was still identified with the ego. So there was kind of a combination of this detached observer with the ego itself, a kind of inner duality. So it was a sort of awakening, but not true self-realization. The self itself was awake, but hadn't woken up to itself through this physiology yet. And so that meant, though, that I was kind of observing the whole thing. So not just my waking activity, but during the night sleep and dreams and so on like that, there was a quality of observer there, and a continuity of self, so to speak, that didn't come and go when you fall asleep at night. The ego self is a mind construct, and it goes to sleep at night when you sleep. So it kind of comes and goes. Oh, doesn't like the idea of that, but it does. And whereas the larger self, the self of consciousness, is with us all the time, and that continued along for quite a few years. And I got involved with a career and got married and had a family, sort of routine businesses. So the spiritual development kind of continued, but it was more backdrop for quite a long time. And then in the mid 2000s, things started changing again. My old life fell away, and spirituality came back in the foreground more. And then I met Lauren Lucia Hoff, who are spiritual teachers out here on the in Western Canada, and then finally with some exposure to them, some darshan, as people say, self woke up here as well. And I think probably because of the long witnessing that had been going on, that then the next couple of stages came fairly quickly. So I had the step through what's known as God consciousness, which is essentially an awareness of the fine mechanics. When you first wake up, there's kind of the surface mechanics of the body-mind, and then underneath there's that consciousness of the eternal consciousness that underlies all experience. But between those two layers, there's a number of other things. I spoke about that during the Science and Non-Duality Conference this fall, those layers. But essentially, those layers begin to become conscious, and so we begin to see how consciousness is actually not just our own fundamental nature within, but it's the fundamental nature of everything around us as well. Everything arises out of consciousness. That process of becoming becomes apparent in a number of ways. And then there's another shift happened then, which is generally known as unity consciousness, where the self that's underlying the world is recognized to be the same self as the self that we've woken up within. So I woke up to, it's kind of like the world then appeared as if a movie screen, and the consciousness was the screen, and the world was playing out on the screen, and that consciousness of the screen was the same consciousness as was here, looking out, was looking back, basically. The world, you're looking out at the world, and the world is looking back to you, so to speak. And so the dynamics there of being the observer and the observed, they come together into one thing, and then there's just what remains is the process of experience, perception, and the dynamics of experience itself. And the unity stage has a quality of stages in itself, sub-stages, you could say, and there's a progressive development of, as you just live life and have experiences, and you realize, oh, that is myself also, and oh, that is myself also, and it's kind of this gradual, progressive uniting of all the layers of experience and memories and all these layers of your life into one wholeness. And there comes a point, and there's different ways this is experienced, but comes a point where consciousness knows itself both locally and in the fullness of itself. And then once it knows itself fully, that kind of process is complete. The process of development in consciousness is complete. And then consciousness can look beyond itself, which is kind of an interesting thing. Somebody in self-realization or unity experiences consciousness as being infinite and eternal and boundless. It doesn't. It's endless. So how could it have an outside?
Right.
But then when you get to that point, it can look beyond itself, and you realize that it too is another layer of becoming. And it has a source in what the Vedic tradition calls Brahman. Brahman is a challenging thing to talk about because it's beyond experience, beyond the process of experience, beyond consciousness. And yet the seeds of consciousness are in there. So the way they talk about it in the text is that the Brahman knows itself. You know it by being it. It's not experienced in the same way, although it has a quality of being conscious. It's because the qualities of consciousness come out of Brahman.
It's not like being conscious of an object, right?
Exactly, yeah. And it's an even greater non-duality or greater union than unity even. And it's because even the subtle duality of experiencing or of being, because the sense of being implies a non-being, and the sense of consciousness requires a non-consciousness, whereas Brahman is beyond that and it inclusive of all of it. So it gets quite complex. And then since the interview from 2015 that you mentioned in the introduction, there's been another unfolding, which is known as Para-Brahman. And para-Brahman is um, well, para means beyond or greater than. So it's kind of obscure to think of something greater than Brahman as well. But there is this quality of what could be best described as pure divinity. Mm-hmm. That's even greater than Brahman. An analogy I've used is, for example, the experience of pure consciousness. Most of the time in our day-to-day experience, we experience consciousness with content.
Yeah.
We're having this experience, we're noticing that, we're there's this thought, there's this emotion, all these things are going on and we're noticing it. But then when we have a deep meditation, we go within, we can have experiences of pure consciousness, or we can have the experience of awareness without content. And this is somewhat equivalent, where you have divinity without, there's no other real name for it, but without content, without expression, without any of the qualities that we might have ascribed to consciousness and so on. And yet it has a completeness. And once again, it can only be known by itself.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
Profoundly abstract.
Yeah, right. I mean, there's so much richness there, and so I want to go back just a little bit and maybe and take a few points. One of them is, just sort of. Obviously, you're speaking of, and what I love about a word that you use a lot in the book you wrote is refinement, and this constant, sequence of more subtle refinements, which is also a word that my teacher uses quite a bit as well, and I guess just to contrast that sort of subtle refinement process with something that you see a lot, I just wanted to get your kind of thoughts on this, which is, a lot of spiritual teachers who sort of have a kind of aha moment, and then they speak of this sort of punctuated moment, and it's sort of like, it's always, and it's sort of like, and then I was awakened. And what I hear you saying is that, like, no, there's much more sort of subtle stages of this, blah, blah, blah. So is this kind of first, juncture of awakening that a lot of spiritual teachers might speak about, is it tend to be the same one? And when you see it happening in other spiritual teachers, which stage of the process is this usually? Is it the first one, or is there kind of how would you explain
well,
that?
It varies, and this is where it's a little complicated to take a look at. For example, those in the Papaji lineage from Ramana are taught not to speak about stages.
Right.
And yet, if you listen to, for example, Gagaji's interview on Buddha at the Gas Pump, it's kind of clear that she goes through the stages. Yeah. But she doesn't use that kind of language. She just kind of talks about, these progressive openings. And so they don't talk about stages to avoid concepts of stages.
Right.
Of course, the concepts are not it. The map is not the road.
Yeah.
And that's the hazard of talking about this. You can, read my book and gather all these concepts about, what it's supposed to be like, but the actuality is a whole different thing.
Right. And sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Even for myself, I studied these ideas earlier on and had these concepts about what it was supposed to look like, but the actuality is beyond the mind. And so the mind can never meet that. So I had to basically throw it all out again and then bring it back again within this new context and realize, oh, that's what he meant. It wasn't really this thing. It was this thing.
Yeah. I mean, I really appreciate your insight about concepts, because I've seen you write about it, and then you also talk about it in the interview as well, which is, that they're kind of necessary, but they're also obstacles. Like you because the opposite, right? If you didn't have any kind of conceptual vocabulary, then you wouldn't have any way to kind of situate your experience. And maybe if you grew up in a kind of, for example, rigid Judeo-Christian idea of things, you would experience a kind of awakening moment in the kind of, colors or garb of something that would be problematic, or,
Yeah, and it's an interesting conundrum, because on the one hand, the map can be confused with the road, but on the other hand, do you deny a person a map when they're on the road? Because there are certainly people, quite a few people now, who are waking up outside of any tradition.
Yeah.
And I've spoken with a number of people who had no expectation of enlightenment. They may even have had a spiritual interest, but enlightenment wasn't on the table. And then when it showed up, they had no idea what to make of it.
Yeah.
And so they needed some support. And some of it, I think, assumes that the teacher will be available when the event happens. And so then they can have that conversation. But if you're outside of a tradition, or another thing that happens sometimes is that people will have shifts that in a way that are not how it's described in that tradition.
Yeah.
In my own experiences, as I mentioned earlier, about witnessing all that time before I finally woke up in the tradition that I was first had. In that tradition, witnessing full times means you are awake.
Yeah.
Quite often it does, but sometimes it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's always all these variations. And, as you mentioned, there's the, things like sometimes people wake up and there's a sense of an ego death and a falling away into a sense of no self and into a grand emptiness. And other times people have the shift and they wake up to a fullness,
right,
and a self, a cosmic self.
Yeah.
A very clear sense of cosmic
It's like the
self.
Hindu versus the Buddhist experience.
Yeah, and they're actually both completely valid. And
Yeah.
sometimes it's a framing thing. If a person has a Buddhist background, I've met people who talk about no self and frame it that way, even though they do experience cosmic self.
Yeah.
But because of their background, they frame it as no self. And that adds another trickiness to the layer because the language they're using may be related to their tradition rather than their experience.
Yeah.
And there's all those things. And there's also people who have a sense of expanding from being a small me. They expand into becoming a cosmic self. There isn't a break in the same kind of a way. Or they have a devotional surrender. There's a bunch of different ways that shift can be experienced.
Do you think that there's a real issue with, people having these experiences and then, given our kind of medical approach to psychological states, that they would be read as sort of forms of psychosis?
It does happen sometimes that people misunderstand it. I mean, one of the better known stories related to that is the book Collision with the Infinite.
Mm-hmm.
Was written some years ago. That was a woman who woke up who had some context, but her experience didn't match her understanding, and she refused to accept. And she even had people tell her that she'd woken up, but she refused to accept it.
Oh, wow.
And she basically fought it for 10 years.
Wow.
And went through a lot of very difficult times. So that's kind of an extreme and unusual version. And then finally she accepted it and actually had her unity shift pretty quickly after that.
Mm-hmm.
But generally, and there could be, but when she didn't accept it, she then actually went to a psychologist to try and get them to pathologize her experience. She was looking for that.
Yeah, right.
But yes, the Western psychologists, for the most part, don't have any context for this.
Yeah.
So they can. It depends on how it's being experienced, though, because after a shift, there can be quite a bit of purification. Sometimes, sometimes not, but sometimes, and a period of settling in and integrating and so on like that. And if you just kind of list out the symptoms of the side effects of what's going on. For someone who doesn't have any background in this, it can perhaps seem like some kind of a psychological, because the ego has collapsed in some way, or is dysfunctional in some way, or isn't responding in the normal kind of way, and it really depends on how it's unfolding. So it is really useful to be able to have help if those kinds of things are going on, so you're not kind of just thrashing around and fighting it. You want to be able to support what's unfolding. Now, just to be very clear, the vast majority of people that I know who have shifted have not had those kind of traumas. But it does come up once in a while.
Yeah.
There's those possibilities. For most people, it's just kind of this process of there's like Adyashanti, for example. He talks about a honeymoon after the awakening, and then the mind trying to come back up again, and or framed another way, that the stuff that's you now have this big open space, and the anything that's remains to be purified basically rushes into that space to be cleared.
Yeah.
And there can be then a whole lot of unpacking going on.
Yeah. That makes sense.
And that's quite normal, and just people get used to it. Generally speaking, if they've been on a spiritual path for a while,
yeah,
they're used to that anyway. So
So I have one question. Well, two questions actually. One is related to kind of the reason why maybe there would be a prescription or a suggestion not to kind of share these stages. Is it partly because there's kind of a reaching or a kind of chasing after certain experience as a kind of like collection of, it's like I'm collecting my, my shiny new car. I'm collecting stage 2 and stage 3, and then I can go and talk about how I've, reached stage 2 and stage 3, so I can, establish myself as sort of in some sort of superior position to other spiritual seekers. Is that like part of
Well,
the
there can be that dynamic. The chasing experience is definitely an issue. Like some spiritual communities are now getting involved with things, or people, spiritually oriented people rather, are getting involved with things like hallucinogens
yeah,
and going on medicine journeys and stuff. And quite often that's motivated by a chasing of experiences
yeah,
and an idea that the experiences are it. But awakening isn't an experience. It can have experiences that come with it,
yeah,
but it's actually a shift in your sense of who you are, a shift
right,
in a change in what it is that's looking out through these eyes, or at least your awareness of what it is that's looking out through. I mean, it doesn't actually change at all. It just shifts where you're experiencing it from. And it's also useful to know that it's not, you don't actually ever wake up. No one wakes up. You wake up from the me. You
yeah,
don't, not the me that wakes up. You wake up from it,
yeah,
and you shift back into this larger aspect of yourself. And so those kind of things can help a little bit with context.
yeah.
But yeah, there's definitely a spiritualization of uh, various concepts and stuff, and yeah, competitive spirituality and that kind of thing can go on.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, one of the things you mentioned that I really appreciated was that the kind of physiological experiences, it's not the physiological experiences themselves because sometimes they have sort of common features, and so the kind of the experience itself of the awakening stage is confused with sort of accompanying physiological symptoms, and I really like appreciated that
Yeah,
because also I think it also dovetails with your observation or the thing you like to mention about puberty. It's a natural process and it happens to everyone, but how it sort of shows up and manifests is quite variable.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so there's kind of when someone shifts, there's kind of three parts of the shift. Now, some people have very quiet shifts, but quite often there can be both experiences that are triggered by the shift and purification that's triggered by the shift. But the experiences and purification both go away. They end, as everything, all experiences do. They come and they go. And whereas the actual shift is behind all that. And if you get confused, because even some people who wake up get a little confused by that, and they start trying to look for the experiences again,
yeah,
because the experiences go away. But the actual shift is behind that. But as it gets more clear and solid, those kind of things get more obvious. That's more just right after the shift.
yeah.
Some,
So back to the what you mentioned about hallucinogens, because I actually wanted to ask you about that. Do you think, is your opinion on them that because I've heard people say that it's sort of they can wreak havoc on your subtle body because it's really intense and obviously and that can sort of distort the awakening, and then there are people who are obviously of the mind that they kind of fast forward the awakening process or sort of are kind of radical purifiers and tools of purification. So do you have a perspective on the use of psychedelics as a kind of tool?
yeah, well, that first is actually my perspective.
Yeah,
Where it can give big flashy experiences and stuff, but again, awakening isn't about experiences.
yeah,
It's about what's behind experiences, beyond the mind and beyond those dynamics. Excuse me. And the um, and as you mentioned, some of those hallucinogens can create quite strong um, stresses in in the subtle
yeah,
physiology, energetic stuff, which actually get in the way of waking up. Um, my own experience on long retreats and so on is that people that have spent any time in experimenting with the more powerful drugs and things were the ones that had the poorest experiences.
uh, yeah,
So,
yeah,
yeah, so it's not a recommended path in the modern journey. and some of the I don't know. There's some euphemisms around it that people use that are, I don't know, a little bit misleading. It's not from the Western culture. It's from an ancient culture, and it's being used outside of the context of that culture usually. And um, I can certainly see its benefit in certain very specified circumstances, perhaps.
Yeah.
Um, but
Like any medicine.
yeah,
Mm.
exactly. But as a spiritual practice, I don't think that's a great idea. There's apparently quite a few of the sadhus wandering around in India that are stoned on pot. And it's the same kind of thing. It's like
Yeah,
pot, this fog, and subtle fog, and so that really doesn't help you see through the veils.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what about you mentioned? I think I'm getting the term right. I was looking it up and I couldn't place it in the book, but I think you mentioned, is it deflected Kundalini? The
Oh
ex-
yeah, that's a very specialized kind of a thing. It's not typical, but yeah, there is. I found it really interesting because I've seen a couple of examples.
yeah.
Not over a lot of people we're talking about, but just a couple of examples. But it did really explain the behavior of a few people that I'd met
Can
back
you
in the
describe what that is? What is deflected Kundalini?
well, basically, the physiology has a number of channels, and Kundalini means coiled. Essentially, it's the energy coiled up at the root of the spine. As that starts to open up, there's various channels that it can flow through. What you want is the Kundalini Shakti to rise up the center line, up the Sushumna, up to the crown, and but what can happen in certain cases, there are secondary channels out the side
Hmm.
that the Saraswati and other ones. I'm no expert at this, but there are other channels where it can rise up more easily and get close to the top.
Hmm.
And so a person can have the Shakti go up the side channel, start having lots of spiritual experiences, may have things like charisma and abilities show up and so on. But it doesn't actually go all the way to the top, so it can't actually sustain the an awakening experience, and it's not an actual awakening, and so and it goes up and down, and so it kind of creates a bipolar kind of an effect in their behavior and so on. It's not a true awakening. Now, it's important on the subject of Kundalini to mention, though, that to be clear again, along the lines of chasing experiences, the Kundalini is the energetic support structure for stabilizing and awakening in the physiology, but it's not causal.
Right.
So, in a similar way, the key is going to source, what the yoga tradition calls samadhi, or the Upanishads refer to as turiya, is going beyond the mind into source, and on a regular basis, and then that becomes familiar and integrated, and it prepares the physiology, makes us much more prone to awaken. Um, Whereas trying to force or push the Kundalini can cause problems. I know a few people who have gone through a process like that, and it tends to make their process rougher,
Hmm.
uh, because the Kundalini will open naturally through spiritual progress when it's appropriate, and kind of forcing that can cause roughness.
Yeah. Now, when you say that Kundalini is causal, do you, or not causal? Excuse me.
Okay.
Do you mean that it doesn't? It's not the cause of the awakening process.
Yeah.
The
Yes. But
movement of Kundalini is it accompanies the kind of shift that takes place.
yeah, it's a way for integrating the shifts into the subtle bodies. And so it's a part of the process, just like clearing the physiology and exposure to the source, as I mentioned earlier,
Hmm.
pure consciousness. Um, but from my experience, it's not the means.
Yeah.
It's useful to understand a little bit, but because there are various kinds of things you can experience, kriyas and so on, as the different channels open up
Mm.
and like that. But it in itself is not the cause of awakening.
Right. So, one of the really interesting things that you mentioned that I really appreciated was, you talk about in your own experience having kind of a vision of Krishna, even though you didn't kind of finish explaining it in the interview, but it sounded a bit like you didn't have necessarily a concept for the personal God. It wasn't like Krishna, you had some sort of devotional practice towards Krishna, but it appeared in this way. But you mention how, there are images that can arise based on your own physiology or experience or karma or conditioning, and that the important thing is to emphasize is what you call the feeling value of the vision and not the form it takes, which I thought was really kind of beautiful. So can you talk about the feeling value and what the role of this is in the process of awakening?
Yes, yes. It's a one of the reasons why that's important is also because there's um, one of the concepts we don't have in the West is so much is that those various levels between the physical, we have the physical, the energetic, emotional, the mental, the intuition, intellect, fine feeling level, the causal, celestial, the bliss body, what's called, and what's known as Chittamaya, and then pure consciousness itself. There's kind of those 7 primary levels, and there is life on all of those levels. We tend to, our most of our sensory focus is outwards into the world that we're living in, and so we generally only recognize physical beings. But with the refinement of perception and so on, those other values of life can unfold to our perception. Um, and that's where recognizing the feeling value is useful, because there are some, just like in the physical world, in the next level down, there's a range of beings. Some people call that the astral, in kind of a broad way you can say, who are there. Some of them are, have roles as guides or support people, and some of them are, humans between lifetimes, and so on. But there are also those who are not really cooperating with the process.
Yeah.
And so they're kind of troublemakers, or you could say. And that's kind of a field of, especially when you get into the mind, the field. Essentially, they can appear however they choose. Some things can, and so they can appear to us however they want to appear, and they can call themselves some fancy name and have some fancy appearance, but they'll be there. Trying basically to looking to getting attention,
Yeah.
and perhaps trying to manipulate us in some way, and that's really not healthy. And so, paying attention to how those kind of things feel is important, because divine beings, the things that are a little bit more subtle than that, they're very aware of their connection with the divine. They know they have a very clear dharma or purpose in life, and they don't mess with people that way.
Yeah.
They're supportive, but they don't mess with people, and so the feeling value is quite different.
Yeah.
So, the broad advice I would give if you're starting to experience subtle beings is to just leave it. Put most of your attention on your life in the world, and not get into it too much until you're aware of both.
Yeah.
And then you know the differences and stuff like that. But in the meantime, just use the feeling value to kind of share. Some of my experiences there made me kind of circumspect. So when Krishna first showed up, I was kind of like, okay, what's this? I don't need any more of that stuff in my life. and so, I didn't know what to make of that. And of course, I was in a tradition that talked about having a personal God.
You were in a tradition, or weren't?
Was at the time.
Okay.
And so I had these concepts about it, and thought, okay, well, here's a form of God showing up. Is he supposed to be my personal God in some way? But I didn't have any kind of connection with him on that level. But over time, it became clear that his role was more to point me higher.
Yeah.
To take things further, and then I, much later on, I found out about this tradition in the Vedic canon of the Panchadevata, which basically means the 5 forms of God, and there's kind of like 5. There's kind of there's different perspectives on this, because there's like the Trinity perspective,
Right.
Shiva, Vishnu, Brahma, And then there's this other kind of perspective that's of a 5, and they're kind of more associated with the levels coming down. There's a whole gazillion different perspectives, of course, of all this stuff, but there's different ways relating to it. And I was simply experiencing one version of that aspect of the 5, because later on other ones showed up, and then it became clear that none of them was the personal God, so to speak. They were, and I should mention in this too, there is this what I call the personal and the impersonal. There's kind of like two modes of relating to our experiences. The impersonal is kind of like relating to the world through the intellect. And in that perspective, we can see principles and functions, and the perception becomes more refined, and we see the way things work on an underlying level, but in a way that science would look at it, look at the world as principles and processes and so on. And then there's the personal, and in the personal we shift to the same principles, but now they're embodied. They're everything that happens is being done by some form of being, and they have a role to play in that. And so there's each of those modes has advantages. It's much simpler and cleaner to take an intellectual, impersonal approach to the world, and to see the overall process and so on. But if we want to get down into the details of how something actually works, being able to have a conversation with the being that's responsible for something is can be handy, and it can be practical sometimes too. For example, if I'm on a plane ride and the plane is quite rough, I can have a conversation with the wind Davis. They're involved, and they'll ask them maybe if they can move over.
Yeah.
Give us
I'm not too fond of this turbulence. Can you please move elsewhere? So is this, when you're talking about the impersonal personal, it sort of makes me think of the Vaishnavas versus the Shaivas, where, Shiva Shakti is sort of like consciousness and energy dancing, and it's kind of an impersonal, even though they sort of utilize personal imagery, and then the Vaishnavas being the highest is the personality. So is I sort of feel like you're saying that these sort of exist simultaneously and without contradiction, and aren't sort of hierarchically opposed to one another. Is that sort of what you're saying, or is there sort of one that is?
There are two. I just look at them as two modes, and for me, it's like changing focus. What is it that I'm putting my attention on? Using the intellect to analyze it, or shifting more into the intuitive side. You could say heart and mind. There's different ways of looking at that, but it's slightly different ways of relating to the world. But it's almost just like changing focus.
Yeah.
And different, and you relate to it in different world, and as a way. And as I mentioned, it's most of the time I work in an impersonal, because it's just otherwise it's too much information all the time. Just it simplifies the being in the world.
One of the arguments around, if I can just press this a little bit, one of the arguments I feel like around the personality that sometimes, because I am the same as you, I feel generally inclined towards a kind of impersonal, recognition of all of this. But there have been times, particularly when I was traveling in India, where it was almost like I was playing with the experience of the divine as person, and there was a kind of intimacy that was provoked by that, and it felt comforting in a way. And so is there a part of it, that is the impersonality inherently lonely in a certain kind of sense, or is that, I don't know how to frame this question, but what would call us from the kind of sense of feeling intimate with the world, what would call us towards that intimacy if we were perceiving the absolute in this kind of impersonal way?
Yeah, it's an interesting way of looking at it. There's people who are more inclined to be devotional, and people are more inclined to the intellect. It's not, when I first looked at that stuff, they talk about the yogas or paths, the Jnana Yogi and the Bhakti Yogi and all that. And I used to think they were kind of black and white kinds of things when I first, like the danger of concepts again.
Yeah.
But what I realized is that we're all kind of a mixture, and one tends to be emphasized more than another. I have a strong intellect, for example, but that doesn't make it, doesn't mean that the others aren't part of the picture. The other part of it is the stages in consciousness emphasize certain stages. Waking up has a strong component of the karma yogi in it because it's a process of experiencing the self within, or spirit, or pure consciousness, however you want to word that, and then taking that out into the world and acting in the world and integrating it, and then going back in and out. And it's this kind of like how the dyeing the cloth analogy in India, where you go, you dip the cloth in the dye, and then you hang it out in the sun to bleach in the activity of the day, and then you go back in and dip yourself in the source, and you go back out and bleach it in activity. And it's by going back and forth that you integrate them and make the color fast. There's also this stages aspect where, for example, in the God consciousness stage, there's much more likely to be a more heart orientation, more devotional phase. And in a sense, there's these kind of two, in the stages model I talk about, there's kind of these two parallel processes of consciousness waking up to itself in the different layers. But intertwined with that is this refinement process that's taking place. And they're kind of like the Shiva and the Shakti processes. And a lot of the non-duality teachings at the moment tend to emphasize the Shiva side, the consciousness, or however they want to frame that side, with much less of the Shakti side, much less about the world is dismissed as an illusion, and this thing, which is kind of our renunciate approach.
Yes, right.
Whereas when you're living in the world, you're in the world too, and so how do you integrate those two aspects, and including the feminine or the Shakti side? Brings it a fullness, a richness that's not there with just a plain Shiva by itself.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like, and that's where the impersonal and personal play as well. The personal, the Shakti, the form, the expression is much more of the heart and the personal, whereas the Shiva is much more of the impersonal and the observing consciousness, the detached awareness.
So one of the questions that comes up about this, and then I want to walk through the stages, just so everyone can kind of hear them, kind of laid out in a kind of bullet point sort of way. And we'll do a short summary of each one. But one of the things that comes up is the question of the ethical, right? And especially with all of the stuff that's been happening, obviously, in spiritual communities, where we can argue that certain beings had radical experiences of consciousness, but then they were sort of shitty people. And so, what part is, I hear a little bit that what you're saying is that the ethical is sort of something that kind of happens in the kind of refinement process. But is it possible, I guess one question is it possible to reach these higher states of consciousness and still not be a good person? Or is there a particular level where that sort of what we would call the ethical or the moral, or what makes us show up in the world as a a better human being is something that takes place?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but at the Science and Non-Duality conference this fall, Rick Archer and a group of them have founded an association for professional spiritual teachers.
Amazing.
APSD, and they've got a website and that kind of stuff, and they've got there's webinars going on and that kind of thing. And it's basically like a peer support thing for spiritual teachers, because in the modern age, a lot of the spiritual teachers are essentially independents on their own, and many of them don't have peer support and that kind of thing, and so it's easier to get caught in their stuff. And especially when there's all these students who are adulation and all that kind of thing going on. But yes, it's because there's this awakening doesn't stop us being human. There's still a human there. Ken Wilber had talked about waking up, growing up, and cleaning up. That's quite valid, because there's waking up doesn't make us grow up. They're different things. Because waking up is happening at a very deep level. There's still the human up front. And waking up doesn't mean becoming a teacher either. That's one of those myths that needs to be blown up, because just because you have some real, you might really feel like you want to share after you have a profound shift, But you may also find that most people who you know don't relate to it very well.
Yeah.
Kind of like they're kind of like, "Oh, what's wrong with you?" And and going out and just starting to teach doesn't it doesn't necessarily mean you have teaching skills, because teaching is a skill.
Right.
It's something we don't necessarily have. And some people are born teachers, and they just have that skill naturally, and some people don't. I'm a writer. I'm not so much a teacher. That's not quite where my skill area is. I tend to talk a little too high and abstract for a lot of people. um, but sorry.
The waking up, growing up, the kind of
Yeah,
waking up, growing up. Yeah.
yeah. So one of the things I realized, Adyashanti doesn't talk about this quite the way, but he talks about head, heart, gut.
Hmm.
And what I realized in my experience is the ego has kind of um, a threefold layers. There's kind of the concept of a me that the ideas we kind of have this story. It's very subtle, but we have this story about being this person, and that has this job and has this name, and so on like that. Underneath that, on the level of the heart, there is the energetic drivers of
Yeah.
that story. And then down in the gut, there's what I call a core identity. Suzanne Marie calls it existential identity. Um, that's kind of like this grip. That's historical. It started many thousands of years ago, when we lost connection in group consciousness. Um, Group consciousness goes through these large cycles over
Like
time,
the yugas.
rising and falling. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And rising and falling consciousness. We're in a rising cycle at one point, but in the prior fall, there was the loss of connection with divinity, and so we kind of grasped onto what was still there that we knew, and the sense of identity, this core sense of identity, and that's usually unconscious until um, a certain point. Now, for a long time, I associated head, heart, gut with awakening, self-realization, and that God consciousness, because the awakening heart is part of the God consciousness process, and then the unity shift. But I've since seen that they're not necessarily synchronized. Like Suzanne Marie, in her case, she had that release with her Brahman shift after unity. Um, and I know people I know someone, for example, in Brahman who's recently had their heart opening after Brahman. So they haven't got to the core identity yet. So there's still some thread of identity in there, of personal stuff. Um, Now, of course, this is me analyzing it in fine detail.
Yeah.
The average person may not notice in quite such, but essentially there's a process. And in the Vedic tradition, they talk about it taking 12 years to mature into an awakening. Um, and indeed, people who wake up and then start teaching right away, it's usually a little premature.
Yeah.
Still, there's usually a lot of unpacking still going on, and you really don't want to be dumping on your students. Um, but there's in any case, and then if you could then go on and have other stages, then those stages have to be integrated as well. So it takes time to mature this stuff, um, and to clear all those levels of it, because each of those levels has their, I talked, the experience for me when the center fell out of the concept of a me, and when I woke up, there was this sense of shrapnel. It had been blown up, and there was this kind of shrapnel floating around of these related stories that tied into the central story, that had to be resolved over time. And some of them roasted by the shift, but some of them not. And it just took time for them to come up and, oh, that's still there. No, that's not true anymore.
Yeah.
Just kind
Yeah.
of clearing house. It took a little time. And each of them is true on that. If you clear the concept of a me, but there's still energetic drivers, it can still show up here and there, because the drivers can still push to the surface. And so it just kind of takes time to wind those down. Um, yeah.
So the 12 years you're mentioning, the 12 years it takes, or I don't know who you
So
were
that's
citing. It's
yeah,
one of those things. Well, it made me think of the Geshe education. Do you think that's why, like the kind of, it takes like the 12-year Buddhist education process? Is that maybe the justification for that? Is that there's
Could
been
be.
some kind of like intuitive understanding that this is sort of like the timeline.
It could be. I'm not as familiar with Buddhism. I've studied Buddha's teaching himself, but not the various modern branches of it. I know Buddha himself spoke to these stages, but there isn't a surviving model of unfolding.
Yeah.
I did have a Buddhist academic tell me that there was stages equivalent, actually what he considered better version of stages than my model. So I asked him, great, send it to me and that, but what he sent me was incomplete. And what I see in the Buddhist perspective, in a broad kind of way, anyways, is that they have, for example, the 10 bulls model, which is a process of the stages in their practice towards waking up. So it's a process, and it's quite specific to their practice, the way they approach overcoming the ego. And then they talk about these really high qualities of a fully enlightened bodhisattva and that. But what about in between? What's the process in the middle there?
Yeah.
And that's not really defined in modern Buddhism, particularly from what I've seen. Mm. But even in the within the Vedic community, a lot of this, what I'm talking about, has been lost as well. Yeah. There's all kinds of concepts that have become common that really don't support what their original understanding has been lost.
Yeah, that's something that Paul talks about a lot as well. He talks about that, one of the features of the Kali Yuga is that this sort of systematic, coherent, body of sadhana has been lost. That sort of sequential, the understanding of like the sequential unfolding of the absolute is sort of is not available or has been sort of obscured, and we've got our kind of everything but the kitchen sink kind of salad bar spirituality sort of taking its place. So I just want to ask a very kind of silly basic question, but for those who are maybe not as familiar with these topics, when we're talking about 12 years of practice, just obviously this is a number, but are we talking about 12 years of like meditation practice, like devoted meditation practice? Is this
what I'm talking about is 12 years after awakening for it to fully mature?
I see. Yes.
And of course, that's a broad number. Everybody has their own process, but it just kind of gives a perspective on it. So there isn't the expectation that you wake up and then all your problems are gone. And
right.
It's kind of like a panacea for your humanity. It's not. It's a whole different thing. It's a whole other layer to human life, and it brings a richness and fullness that's beyond any concepts that I had about it before. But it is a process, and it's still, for me, it's still unfolding very much, and there's still areas of little shadows that come up that I thought that was gone a long time ago, but some event comes along and brings it to the surface, and there's some deeper level that hasn't been cleared yet, and there's still new vistas that are unfolding, and in fact the vistas now go beyond anything that I had concepts for before.
But the practice that's supporting this refinement is a daily meditation practice.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
But then would you, from your perspective, if say tomorrow my first stage of awakening begins, if I don't then meditate daily, is that sequential unfolding still going to take place, or will it not? Will it sort of be held off until I find the time to invest in the supportive practices?
Well, it's an interesting point, actually, because I know a few people who felt done when they woke up. And actually, a few weeks ago, I had a fellow write me and joke about the fact that he's felt done for the third time. Because there is that thing, because if there's a clear awakening, it can feel like you're complete, you're liberated, you're done. And so there are people who invest in that, or they kind of believe in that and become identified with that in some way, and they think that's it. There's no more, and they'll mature into that. But that concept can be a barrier to further progress. I mean, there's a section in the Rig Veda where one of the famous sages talks about the importance of desiring unity. So there has to be some well, he's pointing out there needs to be some intention to continue, not a strong, like, it doesn't need to be the seeker's desire kind of thing anymore. That falls away, but just some intention to move in that direction
Yeah.
rather than resistance or whatever. But from my perspective, for that intention to be there, you have to know it's there.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't know that there's unity, there's more beyond self-realization, then there isn't going to be that movement necessarily. Now, some people have it anyways. I've certainly had people tell me that what I'm saying is nonsense and it's a bunch of concepts and so on like that. And then they've opened up to the next stage and they say, okay, right, okay.
You were right. There was some discernment there. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there was some more there. Okay, but yeah, there it is. It is very common for people to think they're done after a clear self-realization,
Mm.
and but like I mentioned, this guy has felt done now for the third time.
For the third time, probably feel done fourth, fifth, sixth,
Yeah, yeah,
as many seven stages as there are. So,
yeah.
so I have a question that's sort of one of these ones that I think comes up a lot for people, which is, one of the kind of, and this goes back to our sort of ethical question, of course, which is, people hear this and they think, well, that's all well and good, but what are we going to do about, Trump, patriarchy, racism, the ecological crisis, and
Actually,
et
it's
cetera, and
really,
so on.
yeah, that's a really good point that I want to talk about a little bit, because one of the things to understand that's different about now than before is that what's happening is consciousness is rising. It's rising very rapidly. People are waking up quite regularly now. It used to be a pretty rare thing, and now it's not, common yet. But there's a lot more waking up going on than there has been. And one of the and there's now also people moving into stages that weren't even talked about before. I mean, I have these fancy names for these things that have happened, have shown up here, but I'm certainly not the only one.
Mm-hmm.
And I was able to write about them in the book because I can talk to a bunch of people that have had those kinds of shifts. And so not just a lot of awakening going on, but there are people who are moving into quite advanced stages now, which are not supported unless the group consciousness can support that.
Right.
There's this rising of group consciousness, which isn't really apparent for the average person on the street particularly yet. But what it's doing on the group level of what's happening on the individual level. And what that means is that group consciousness is rising, and so group consciousness is purifying.
Mm-hmm.
And all this stuff that's been hidden and suppressed and that is being pushed to the surface to be cleared. Now, if you understand that what's taking place is a purification process, you can help support that, and you can help clear things and resolve some of this drama. But if you deal with it on on its own level, and see it as what it, on the surface value of it, and get into a drama, and so then basically you're amplifying it rather than clearing it. And
That would be
so,
like perceiving it as sort of end of days narrative kind of thing. That
yeah,
perception of it.
yeah, we're getting into a big drama about, well, it's kind of like the anti-war versus pro-peace kind of thing that Mother Teresa commented on. Are you going out there fighting against what you don't want, or are you out there pushing for what you do want?
Yes.
What is your attention on? And if you're getting, spending all your time fussing about the drama of Trump and or whatever, then you're putting attention on it, you're amplifying it.
Yeah.
And so what you want to do is look at solutions rather than problems, and that can help resolve what's taking place. And it's kind of like we're being called to go to a higher level kind of thing. And if we can understand that that's the dynamic going on in the world right now, we can help support the thing, because there's essentially a global awakening taking place. And the key now is not if it's going to happen, but how smoothly it's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And the more we can bring the right attitude towards it and support that process, the smoother the process is going to be.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I'm really happy that you said that about, focusing the attention on kind of forging into existence a new sort of, consciousness or reality or program, or however you want to look at it. Because I think some people, they misunderstand that as sort of not being attentive to the fight, or we should focus on fighting these evil demons. Whereas I feel like what you're sort of essentially positing is that as a result of this process of forging into existence the supportive mechanisms of expanded consciousness, you actually dissolve those sources of turmoil in a certain kind of way.
There's another dynamic that's taking place now, which is very new. In the last 5 years, there has been one of the things about the Yuga understanding is that essentially there are certain laws of nature or principles we talk about, those, the life forms, whatever. They go dormant. They go to sleep for long periods of time. When there's, the idea in Kali is that basically 25% of the laws of nature are awake. The rest are all have gone dormant. So what's been happening in the last short while is the whole whack of laws of nature are waking up now from their sleep. And they kind of go through this process of waking up, and then they work as teams. And so they wake up, and then they start integrating with existing awake laws, and it creates new syntheses. And there's this process like that that's taking place. But now in the last year, there's another layer that's going on, even actually probably the last 6 months, that I hadn't seen before, where because there's now people living pure divinity in their physiology, there's kind of we have these kind of layers to the body. There's kind of what's known as the cosmic body, which is essentially a body of all bodies, where you start to live. So typically around advanced unity, if there's a refinement, a refined unity process unfolding, and what's happening is that because people are now living pure divinity, the laws of nature that are operating in their physiology are immersed in divinity. And so they're having spiritual awakenings too now. So it's not just people that are waking up, but it's the actual laws of nature and some of those laws of nature are more local, but some of them are universal. And so there's this process basically where they're waking up in the local experience, and then that awakening is starting to fall back. Even since the interview I had with Rick and Archer, that there's been a process there where it's falling back now into their universal nature, and then it can flow forward into everybody basically.
So when you say, sorry, can I just clarify that? Because I'm trying to sort of, because I love the beauty of the image of awakening laws of nature, but I don't know if I totally understand it, which is, like, are you saying that something like gravity is waking up, or do you mean something like a previously activated movement of consciousness is waking up and beginning its sort of,
okay, there's two different things. This is where waking gets slightly confused there, but there's that first process I was talking about where they're waking up from sleep.
Yeah.
And now there's this process where they're waking up as in enlightenment. They're becoming enlightened. See, their process is different. For us, we take these dips in source until we wake up to it. Whereas for them, they're already very aware of those kind of dynamics. But waking for them is recognizing their divine nature within. They already know it without, but they're waking up to their inner divine nature the way we're waking up to it, through meditation and so on.
Yeah.
And so the process for them is a little different. But by being immersed in it, in someone who's able to live that, there is a process of the actual laws of nature that are supporting our world and our experience that are waking up now too. Now in this case, it's fairly specific. It's things like the devas associated with chakras, the devas associated with mahamarmas, that kind of thing, that are associated with physiology. But it kind of has a cascading thing. So the implication essentially is that there's the awakening process on the collective level is accelerating, and it's reaching another level of profundity, and it should at some point. This should start showing up in the world.
Yeah.
But
I'm looking forward to it.
becoming more obvious for people, because right now we're still talking about fairly subtle levels. But a friend of mine who's quite perceptive recently said that the causal level woke up to itself
Mm.
uh, about a week ago, I guess it was, and that's a whole level of existence. It's awake to itself now.
Mm.
Um, 2 stages forward from consciousness itself. So it's kind of moving forward into that's 2 steps up from what still most people experience, because most people are kind of in the body, mind, emotions range.
Yeah.
In the lower chakras, that's where most of their experience is taking place. So it's not moved into that too much yet, but it is kind of at the higher levels. It's moving forward progressively, and so it'll be quite something.
Right. I'm yeah, I'm
You
I'm looking forward to it, showing up a little more on the surface.
Yes, it
uh,
would be.
yeah.
Yeah. So what we're seeing more is more drama showing up on the surface, because that's where the purification is taking place.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, to end, it's sort of strange to end on these steps, but we might as well end with it. And the post personal stages, which I forgot to ask you. When you say post personal, it's sort of, post this sort of like contraction around the sort of egoic body mind. Is that sort of what you mean by post personal?
Yes. Yeah, the Sophia University refers to transpersonal
Yeah.
development. So because in psychology you have this model of personal development, Levinger's stages of ego development, and
Right.
so on like that, cognitive development, and like that. So these are basically a step past those stages, and it's the stages that come after that. In my talk at the Science and Non-Duality Conference in 2015, I talked about that. I talked a brief review of the psychological stages and how that steps with transcendence, or the practices in our meditation, how we step from a personal development into post-personal or
Yeah.
transpersonal
Yeah.
development. Yeah.
So first stage then of the post-personal development is cosmic consciousness. So can we'll just go sort of point by point, and maybe if you could give a short
Okay.
summary of each one. I know we've talked about all of these basically in different ways, but just getting a little more systematic with it.
Yes, yes. So the first way, cosmic consciousness, is a term that's used, or self-realization is a common term. And essentially that's the self waking up to itself through this apparent person. And it's essentially it's the observer side, the Shiva side of consciousness that's woken up to itself. And so we're typically in some kind of valley of witness, where we're kind of detached, and we're not quite as caught up in our world experience. We continue being the same old human we were before. It's kind of like nothing changes, but everything changes.
Right.
And because what's actually changing has nothing to do with the person and that kind of thing. It's where we're experiencing from, who we experience ourselves as being. But that change of perspective changes a lot of the way we relate to the world and so on like that. We're not in our mind and in our emotions the same way as we were before. We're kind of a step back from them, and we're watching life play out. Now, it depends on the kind of practices a person has. If someone and how much refinement is going on. But if there's less refinement, there isn't really a refinement stage. Then there's more. The next stage will be the stage in consciousness of unity, and in unity, like I described earlier, we wake up to the screen that's behind the world of experience around us. Realize that everything around us is consciousness. It's also, and the consciousness there and the consciousness within us are the same consciousness.
Yeah.
So there's a oneness. And the sense of inside and outside falls away, and we gain this profound intimacy with everything, because it is self. The table, the camera, everything is myself, and there's a profound intimacy that can go on there. And then, as I mentioned earlier, then there's when self comes to know itself fully, there's the opportunity for it to step beyond itself into what is called Brahman in the Vedas. Adyashanti in the last few years has been talking about a second no self stage. That's what he's referring to here.
Okay.
He doesn't. There isn't the language in there quite for that, so he's kind of using no self unity, no self. So those are kind of the three stages in our relationship with consciousness. And then there's the feminine side, the refinement side um, of refinement perception. So there's that can begin before awakening, or it can begin well after, or
Hmm.
it become obvious. It's been going on the whole time, but there's various influences that are bringing on online more. And if there's a refinement process active, then there's a what's known as a God consciousness stage, where there's an awakening heart and a refinement of perception, where we become aware of those layers between consciousness and our more surface level of experience. And there's a gazillion ways that unfolds,
Right.
because there's a lot there to be seen. And some people are more sight oriented, some people are more feeling oriented, some people are more touch oriented. I use visual words because I'm visual, but
Yeah.
it doesn't necessarily show up visually at first, although it may. Um, and then that same refinement continues after the unity shift,
Hmm.
but now in the new context of unity. So it becomes its own stage. So there can be the unity shift, and then an unfoldment of that, and then what was there before comes back in this new context. And at the top end of unity, the highest unification is with our sense of the divine or God. Um, and there's a unification with God. So I am that, I am that, I am the universe, I am all of creation, bigger and bigger. And so the sort of the crowning one is a God realization stage where one unites with God on a very high level.
Hmm.
Um, and then after that, you can go beyond. But again, that may or may not be there, depending on if there's that refinement process underway. And then after Brahman, there's usually a couple of stages. Like sometimes for Brahman, at first um, we're aware of what we don't have anymore, because there's the loss of the intimacy, the oneness, and that we go beyond all that stuff.
Hmm.
And so there can be more of a perception of loss. In the Vedas, it's referred to as the Great Awakening, because it's kind of the biggest of the shifts. You have to essentially surrender the entire enlightenment you had before to step into this new value. And then what is actually there starts to unfold a short while later. And the Brahman begins to know itself. Um, and then there's another version of refinement that can kick in there too, although it's because before it was refinement through the values of the heart and perception and that. But yeah, this is kind of different. Um, I talk about it in the book a little bit, and some of the things that can unfold there, like the cognitions of the Vedic cognition kinds of stuff and that.
Yeah, what did you mean by? I wanted to talk about that actually. We're still on 3A. We're in like the refined Brahmin stage.
Yeah,
Is that correct? What do you mean by Vedic cognition? Obviously, many people will be familiar with the Vedas as the
yeah.
ancient
Well, the
scriptures of
Vedas,
India.
the Vedas are well. It's the main Vedas are cognized, and what that means is that the sage or seer who's having the experience of that kind of has it's like a download, but on steroids. So if I experience this pen, for example, I'm seeing it from one side. I'm seeing it certain qualities and colors and stuff like that. But if I was to cognize this pen, I would know the totality about it. I would be able to see it from all sides. I would know its history, where it came from, what it's made of, all the details about it. And and so it's kind of like this more complete experience.
Okay.
And in the case of a Vedic cognition, they're also kind of inscribed in consciousness, so to speak. So somebody else who's able to be at that level can actually have the same experience. They're kind of encoded experiences, three-dimensional experiences, and so they're kind of a style of experience, but very specific. And there's kind of tiers of it as well. There's people who kind of experience cognitions that are lively in consciousness. They're kind of sometimes they're a bit sleepier, and sometimes they're more lively, and so kind of that they have kind of a basic cognition where they have the experience that's been had before recently, and they revive that still further. But have more people having the experience brings it more and more alive in consciousness. Um, there's a deeper type where you revive a cognition that's gone to sleep, essentially. This aspect of, and then there's law of nature or deva that's associated with these experiences as well. So it's kind of like they enliven that law in creation, and so it can start to function again. And then there's the highest type, which is the Vedic or the original cognition, where that is first brought forward into the creation and brings that law of nature online. Although it's interesting to reflect on because of the process that's going on right now, because I'm seeing laws of nature wake up, which implies that someone out there is having the cognition that wakes them up.
Yeah, yeah.
And someone else, and the interesting thing to note though is that they're actually kind of pre-programmed into our creation, so that a certain person is born at a certain time to have that cognition and bring it forward and evolve the creation.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a blueprint.
So then, with the Vedic cognition, as I hear you describing it, I'm trying to understand sort of the relationship between the Vedic cognition as sort of this kind of principle or fundamental experience in consciousness, and then the kind of transcribed Vedas, as you know, we understand them as manuscripts. Am I understand? Is that sort of, is the transcribing of it sort of filtered through a certain cultural historical context, and therefore it contains the sort of feeling value of the Veda, and yet it is not the Vedic experience purely cognized?
Okay, there's kind of layers to it, and it's kind of interesting. One of the things we tend to think about is the evolution of language. That first we had these languages were developed, and then we developed a written language. But from a perspective of the yugas, the cycles of time, an oral tradition and then a written tradition are actually symptoms of a devolving consciousness.
Right.
And like Vedavyasa was famous for organizing the mandalas, the Rig Veda, and writing them down, because he did that because the cycle of ages we were coming into a dark age, and he wanted to preserve them.
Yeah.
And because the oral tradition was breaking down, or we recognized that it would break down, which it did, and the oral tradition was there to, which was passed down through families to sustain those experiences, but they were in turn a way to try and sustain the wisdom. But if you're able to listen, when somebody chants the Vedas in Sanskrit, if you're able to listen on that level, what's called Ritambara Pragyan, the celestial or the causal level, if you're able to, your awareness is able to sit on that level and listen to those Vedas, there's that potential for that experience to replay in your experience. Mm-hmm. And so it basically, there's a relationship between name and form. In the English language, there isn't, but in Sanskrit, there's the sound of the word that means something, is it has encoded within it the vibrations that actually can create that form. There's a direct relationship between those two things. And so if you're able to listen to those sounds on that level, that can unfold the experience in your awareness. It's kind of like a key that unlocks the door, though, really, because the Sanskrit, the way it's used by the Devas to actually create form, is a kind of a simultaneous way. These complex vibrations through kind of it's almost like a kirtan, call and response sounds, they're speaking kind of simultaneously together to create these really complex vibrations that give rise to form. Whereas when we speak Sanskrit, we kind of speak it the way we're talking right now in a linear sequence of sounds and words. So, but it's a way to kind of, it can be a way to open the door for somebody who's sitting, listening on that level, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the kind of attempt to sort of
That's right. We're talking about the abilities of some people at very high levels of, for most people, it's kind of like you're kind of you're sitting there in meditation and you settle into silence, and then your mind goes like, oh, I'm in silence. But as soon as you start thinking about it,
exactly.
We're talking about somebody able to sit in silence and stay there for a long period of time and have thoughts and do all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
it's a more pretty advanced stuff. Some of this. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, we're sort of entering the end of our time together, but I wanted to ask you, based on the stages that you've been describing and outlining for us, is there anything else that you feel is important to share? Did we miss one?
Oh,
Actually, we
yeah,
were almost, yeah.
yeah. But the last one there, of course, is
Para Brahman. Yeah.
and Parabrahman is kind of where the stage, the two threads of Shiva and Shakti, of Atman and Sattva, they come together.
Yeah.
And Parabrahman is not going to show up if there isn't refinement, because it's like a climax of the refinement. Um, and it has substages within it as well. And that's still unfolding here. So the larger picture, we'll see.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like the source of the source, the pure divinity, and so it's kind of the most interesting, because it's kind of, there's certain things about the dynamics of consciousness. When you see how consciousness creates the world, there's certain things in there that, where does this come from, kind of a thing. Why would it do this and not that? And when you get back into pure divinity, then it actually makes some sense. It's like a guiding hand, so to speak. And this, when I say divinity and stuff, I'm not referring to some old guy with a beard and sitting on a throne in the clouds. It's quite a bit more subtle than that.
Yeah. I'm hoping most people listening to this podcast are privy to that at this point.
Yeah.
So, David, I know that you have your website, Davidya.ca, which is just a treasure trove. I mean, it really, for anybody that hasn't had the pleasure of checking it out, I mean, it really is. I mean, how many years have you been working on that blog?
Well, I started in 2007, so I guess about.
Wow. Yeah, it's just chock full of, again, it's just like an encyclopedia of spiritual kind of, journeying, and it really is a beautiful piece of work. And so anybody that hasn't familiarized themselves with it, please do, Davidya.ca. And then, David, do you want to share anything else about, anything, events coming up that you're participating in? I know you come to the SAND conferences every year. I was there last year, but we didn't make it this year.
Yeah, in some years. Yeah, not particularly. Mostly what I do is I write, and so that's kind of my shtick. I did do a Blue at the Gas Pump interview with Rick, a second one, where we talk about some of these things while I was at the SAND conference, and that's going live this next weekend, probably before this will go up. But yeah, that's basically, every so often I show up and do something like this, and mostly it's the writing.
Well, I'm glad you do. I mean, what's great about you is that you have such a kind of matter-of-fact and humble way of describing all of these things, and it makes it really easy to kind of believe the quite, otherwise what would sound like quite crazy stuff, perhaps to some people who haven't, had these stages of realization yet. Whereas, you just have a kind of mode that makes me trust you, and probably everybody else out there. So that's works in your favor.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm constantly reminded of my humanity. So
it's a good place to be. Well, David, it's been such a pleasure chatting with you.
Pleasure was mine too.